Well, welcome everyone to our second in the series of food security and sustainability, ingredients and recipes. My name is Elizabeth Snell. I'm a member of the Justice and Outreach Committee here at Dublin, the committee that organized this series. We'll start with a land acknowledgement. Jeff Richards will bring that.
Yeah. We honor the original peoples of Guelph and area. This is the traditional territory of the Attawandaran people. The land was the center of their lives and spirituality. We commit to respectful relationships with our indigenous neighbors and with the land.
The agenda this evening is we'll have a speaker, Ralph Martin, and time for Q&A, and then time for some refreshments, some of the food security here, and sort of general chat. There's a washroom right across the hall, and then some more sort of if you kind of wander down that way. But it's either men or women across the. Oh, and the other excitement tonight is that Girl Guides are having their Halloween party next door, so we'll try and put mics on for getting over the screens. We're very pleased Ralph Martin could present the national perspective on food security and sustainability tonight. Ralph Martin grew up on a beef and hog farm in Wallenstein, Ontario. He earned a PhD in plant science at McGill University. Maybe I should use the mic. Yeah. There's no screens yet. Yeah, sorry. His love of teaching grew unexpectedly at the Nova Scotia Agricultural College, and he appreciates how students teach him too. In 2001, he founded the Organic Agriculture Centre of Canada to coordinate university research and education pertaining to organic systems across Canada. From 2001 to 2016, he was the Loblaw Chair of Sustainable Food Production at the University of Guelph, where he is a professor. So clearly he's very well qualified to address us tonight. Ralph.
Okay, thank you. This evening as I was walking home from the university, I was very aware of senescence. And for those of you who don't know what senescence is, it's when leaves start changing color and then falling off. And then I got home and looked in the mirror and I realized there was some senescence going on here as well. And so the theme just continued. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here tonight. I also appreciated the land acknowledgement. And I thank the Anishinaabe Attawandat for how they looked after this land. Sometimes when we think about food security, we think about it in terms of decades or maybe centuries. Europeans have been here for perhaps a couple centuries in this part of the world, in Nova Scotia maybe 4. But the Attawandat have been here for millennia. And we have a lot to learn about food security and sustainability from how they managed. And sometimes people will say to me, well, there weren't nearly as many people here then. I'm not so sure about that, but perhaps we should think about that as being part of the sustainability as well. Maybe having a whole lot of people is not what we really want to be doing. At any rate, I think it's important to realize that in our system today, production is greater than food sales, and food sales are greater than consumption. So what we really want, our goal should be to we want to sustain sufficient production, and we would like that to be equal to adequate, healthy consumption. We want to balance production and consumption. Now, just a bit of context. We expect 9 to 10 billion people by 2050. That might be a 30 to 40% increase depending on how many we have. But at the same time, in developing countries, the average incomes are going up, especially in India and China. And people there are consuming more meat and richer foods, especially in China. And quite often, my colleagues in agricultural economics, and I'm not an economist, and I'm quite proud of the fact that I'm not, but there are other people who are, and they're very good at what they do. A lot of them tell me that we have to increase food production by 70 to 100% to take into consideration the fact that people are eating so much meat than we used to in the past and richer foods. But the population is only expected to increase by 30 to 40. And I want you to remember that. Now there's also a plan B. We've known since the United Nations Cairo conference back in 1990 that the more education girls have, the probability of them having more children goes down. So education for girls is associated with lower population. And that's, if we keep on working on that, maybe we can come in under less than 9 billion. Right now, wasted food in Canada, and if Kay Parizeau was here last week, I'm sure she talked about wasted food. It's now at 40%. That's too high. And we could eat a lot less meat and still get the nutrients that we need. We need some B12 and so on, and there are arguments some people have for eating meat. There are many people who don't. If you want to eat meat, spend the same amount of money now that you spend on meat, just get higher quality and eat less. We could also eat pulses, beans, peas, lentils. They're very good for us. I had a good lentil lunch today. And we can eat insects. There are more and more possibilities with insects. And insects can eat what would normally have exited the food chain altogether. They can convert it back to protein that we can then eat. Now, I want to point this out, and I know this is getting away a little bit from the national. I've done a little bit of globalization here, but I will get back to the national picture. In 1982, the average Chinese person ate 13 kilograms of meat per year. That's gone up to 63, and if it continues, it's going to go up to 93. However, the Chinese government set a goal back in 2016 to, rather than going from 63 to 93, to bring it back down to 30. And they want to do that because of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and they want to reduce the country's problems with obesity and diabetes. And it's quite interesting to me that when the Chinese set a goal, they have a way of achieving goals that we in the West sometimes miss. And just to drive home the point, Michael McCain, the president of Maple Leaf, came out about a year and a bit ago, and he said that Maple Leaf, which has commonly been known as a meat company, is now a protein company. It doesn't mean they're not in the meat business, but they're doing a lot of other kinds of protein, and quite a bit more plant-based protein. If Michael McCain is renaming his company a protein company rather than a meat company, it seems to me that that is a trend that will continue. Now, the problem with meat, and in Canada we've been very, very good at this. What we've been really good at is improving the feed conversion ratio. It used to take about 6-7 kilograms of grain to get 1 kilogram of chicken. Now it only takes 1.7 kilograms of grain, dry grain, or well, maybe 13-14% moisture, to get 1 kilogram of meat. So we've improved the feed conversion ratio a lot, but we've mostly done that dash. We'll never get to 1-to-1. And so if we went from 7 down to 1.7, maybe 1.5, 1.4, we have to find other approaches. And I think the challenge of animal production is to think about feeding animals feed so that humans can eat food. We've been so hooked, and especially in Canada, we've been so hooked on improving the feed conversion ratio that if we have to feed a little bit of food to an animal to make sure that it gets a very good feed conversion ratio, we'll do it. But that, to me, doesn't make sense. 100 years ago, we would never have fed food that we could eat to a chicken. And I can assure you, 100 years from now, we're not going to do it either. We're in a crazy bubble in time where we're feeding food to animals. So I think we should stop that. Now, pastured animals are a good example of animals that can eat grasses and clovers, and they have 4 stomachs. Ruminants have 4 stomachs, sheep and cattle, and they can convert grass to meat and milk. And not only to meat and milk, but to healthy meat and milk. And there are higher CLAs, conjugated linolenic acids, and higher omega-3 levels, and minimal or no antibiotics when they're in pasture. So that's an example of animals eating feed rather than food. Now, I can't remember, no, I didn't have the slide. I do have a slide of a company in the Netherlands called Bonda, and they are getting very good at using co-products or byproducts from the food processing sector, and they're taking all that material and running it through diet programs to make sure that animals get perfectly balanced diets, but not necessarily from corn and wheat and soy that people could be eating. They're using co-products instead. And that's what our chickens used to do on my grandfather's farm, and I'm sure in your grandparents' farms as well. Now, there is a food policy developing in Canada, run by Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. The website is down at the bottom. By the way, I'll make these slides available to whoever here in the committee wants them, and if anybody wants to email me, I'll send them to you. I'm not hard to find. I'm at the university. Just Google don't Google my name. I don't use Google. I'm opposed to Google. DuckDuckGo. Or go to the university website and type in Ralph Martin and send me an email, and I'll be happy to send you the slides. Anyway, there are consultations on food policy across Canada. Some of the things that have been coming back are that Canada produces more food than the people can consume. You remember one of my first slides was that we produce more than we sell more than we consume. And that's been fairly evident in what Ag Canada has been hearing. In spite of that, we still have a whole lot of people who don't have access to enough food. The other thing is that it's really important to address food security based on income security. Food security, I think, is more of a poverty problem than it is a lack of food problem. We have plenty of food in Canada. It's not a food problem, it's a poverty problem. And then there are all the rates of diet-related chronic disease increasing, associated with health costs going up as well. I encourage you to read that report. They don't have a national food policy yet. There are a few countries that do. In Canada, we still don't. There's an organization called Food Secure Canada that did develop one a few years ago. It has not been adopted by any government. The Canadian Federation of Agriculture also had one. I think the Green Party and the NDP also have a food policy, but none of those food policies have yet become the national food policy, and the government is working on that right now. And this just goes to the point about unhealthy eating and chronic diseases. 2/3 of healthcare costs can be attributed to unhealthy eating. And this is put out by CAPI. This is not a flaming left-wing group. This is the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute in Ottawa, and they pointed out that a lot of our sickness is because of what we eat. And then Val Tarasuk at the University of Toronto came out with some really interesting data. The annual healthcare costs, in contrast to food-secure households, if there's marginal food insecurity, the annual healthcare costs are 23% higher. If it's moderate, they're 49% higher. And if the food insecurity is severe, the health costs are 121% higher. I think that's something we really need to pay attention to. And then I put the question there, is food insecurity a problem of sufficiency or poverty? I'm so convinced that it's poverty, I'm just going to tell you that. If you want to dispute that, that's fine. But anyway, you know what my opinion is about that. Now, if I was the Minister of Health or Agriculture or the Premier of Ontario, and you don't have to worry, that's not going to happen, but if I was, I would want to have a policy, and I would say that it's cheaper to provide free Ontario fruits and vegetables for all low-income citizens than it is to continue paying their health costs if they continue with their current diet. And colleagues of mine and I at the university set up this hypothesis. We went after funding to 2 or 3 different sources, and we were spectacularly unsuccessful in getting the funding. But I still think this hypothesis holds water, and if there's anyone who has $400,000 or $500,000 in your pocket and you don't know what to do with, just let us know, and we'll go ahead and do this study. Now, better than that, I would like to argue that we should think about a guaranteed annual income. Now, these 2 economists from the Fraser Institute, and again, the Fraser Institute is fairly conservative, they've argued that it would be cheaper to have a guaranteed annual income than all the other plethora of programs that are in Canada now. And if food insecurity is really a poverty problem, then I think that a guaranteed annual income is something that could help address this issue of poverty and food insecurity. Now, there's been Hugh Segal, a conservative senator, although a progressive conservative one, has been talking about this for a number of years. And he thinks it's a much more humane way to do it. There was a study in Dauphin, Manitoba back in '74, and I was just talking to my uncle, who is now 94, and he was in Dauphin back in '74 as a social worker, and he remembers them doing that study. And of course we had 3 in Ontario until Ford canceled them. And I think these are the kinds of studies that we need, and we need the data. But the one in Dauphin showed that there was very little evidence that people would work less. Some people stayed home to look after sick relatives or children, but other than that, most people still continued working. And now that there's some concern about people being unemployed because of the tech industry, we're looking again at a guaranteed annual income. Now, I do want to say something about wasted food. And I'm calling it wasted food rather than food waste. And it might seem like a nuance, but I was giving a talk about 2 years ago, and I got roundly scolded for talking about food waste rather than wasted food. Food is the noun. It's food we're talking about, and wasted is the adjective describing the noun food, rather than food just being an adjective describing another kind of waste. So I've accepted that that's very important. The number of extra people that we could feed is 1 billion if we just applied what we know how to do now. It's nothing new. No new technology there. All we have to do is apply what we know now. In developing countries, most of the waste is post-harvest. It's in storage. Insects get it. They need help with building better storage facilities. Here, as I mentioned before, most of the waste is in our homes. Half of that 40%, 20%, is in our households. Mostly just because we buy too much and we can't consume it all. In Canada, the cost of wasted food is $31 billion. And that was 2014, so I'm sure it's higher by now. And I know Martin Gooch, the author of this, and I'm pretty sure he's chasing the numbers. He's another one of these ag economists, and they do some useful things sometimes, and I'm sure he'll come up with another number soon. Now, I'd like to think about this in a different way. Households in Canada now spend $153 per week on food. That's maybe a little dated, and that assumes 2.1 or 2.2 people per household. Assuming that 20%, remember we waste 40% in Canada, half of that, or 20%, is wasted in the home. Assuming that 20% of food is wasted in households, then we're throwing out $31 a week. Now, at the same time, a lot of people tell me, oh, I can't afford organic food because it's too expensive. But data from a couple of years ago showed that organic shoppers on average spend $27 per week more than people who do not buy organic food. So, I have two suggestions. You could stop wasting, and then you could go and buy organic, and you can still save $4. So I'd like to just stop there for a minute and give you a chance to talk among yourselves about this and whether or not you think this makes sense or anything else I've said. I'll give you a minute or two, and then we'll carry on before the general discussion. So go ahead. Okay, so I'm the mean guy at the front of the room. You just had a chance to start talking, and now I'm going to interrupt you again, but there will be more time later. Now, this is a church, and I would like to talk about the gospel. I've been preaching this gospel for all of my academic life, and I promise you that if there was a midterm or an exam, this would be on the midterm or exam. So for all my students, they know the gospel according to Martin is going to be on the midterm, and it's going to be on the exam. And it's very simple. Keep your soil covered. When it comes to sustainability, I think there's nothing really more important than we can do than to look after our soil. And one of the key ways to do that is to keep it covered. And these are all the ways we can do it. With forage crops like timothy or alfalfa, service crops are crops that are grown when cash crops are not growing, or they can grow between the rows of cash crops. Underseeded cereals, we can have wheat, and underneath it there can be red clover. And it looks like it's underneath because it's a perennial and grows slowly, and the wheat grows faster. It's an annual, so it looks like it's under. We can have mulches, we can have civil pasture. I'm taking my students this Thursday down to a farm where they have 500 ewes and all their lambs, and they graze them in orchards and woodlots. And there are all kinds of advantages to doing that from the point of view of animal welfare and more development of the trees. And they actually sequester more carbon when you have fast-growing trees in silvopasture than if you have them in a mature forest. And then, of course, there's permaculture. These are all ways that you can address the gospel according to Martin. So if you forget everything else I said tonight, please, please remember the gospel. Now, soil organic matter is good, 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 and it's related to keeping your soil covered. It's added with green manures. Those are the service crops. Brown manures comes out the back end of livestock, and crop residues. And then, of course, it helps to build soil particles into good structure. It allows water to infiltrate into the soil rather than running off and carrying the soil away. And as runoff increases, soil organic matter decreases, and we don't want that. Now, these are photos. Excuse me, may I use this?
Yes.
Okay. This is Martin de Groot. If any of you have had Mapleton ice cream, Martin is the person who runs that operation. And here he's standing in his neighbor's field in the dry summer of 2016, and here he is in his field. The soil organic matter is 6.2% on his farm. Because he's been following the gospel according to Martin, he's had all his soil covered, he's had lots of forages, he's putting manure back on, he's running it as an organic farm. Good root structure, good roots here, high corn. This is what he had to do to get into the soil to dig it up in his neighbors. He had to use a pick. It was that tall and the roots were like that. Now, I'm not trying to say that organic farms always yield more than non-organic farms. In fact, that's not true. On average, non-organic farms have higher yields. However, in a drought year, when conditions are bad, that additional soil organic matter really makes a difference. And as we enter a time of climate change, this is going to become more and more important. Soil organic matter is part of our resilience strategy. And I think it's really important to keep building that up. Now, Sarah Rotz did some work with me and Evan Fraser, and she went to about 120 farms, corn farmers in Ontario, and interviewed them. And what was really interesting was that those who were certified organic had a higher level of soil organic matter on average, not just like as in the past slide, but on average, than those who are not certified. And the other thing that was interesting, as the average number of species on the farm goes up, so does soil organic matter. And the number of species is going to become really important. Now this goes back to soil organic matter. This is from Christine Brown at OMAFRA. Good soil organic matter in sand is anywhere between 2.1 and 3%. If it's clay loam, it should be between 3.6 and 4.5%. This is what we want, or that, but we want good and up. Fair to poor is not what we want. On the prairies, with the buffalo and the grass, soil organic matter could have been 8, 9, 10%. In Ontario, it was before settlement by Europeans, it was probably around 7. This is a line showing the decrease in soil organic matter in all of Ontario from 4.3 to just over 4 within only 15 years. In Wellington County, Waterloo, Wellington, I grew up in a farm that was right on the border of Waterloo and Wellington counties, so I take this very personally. It was at 5%. There's lots of livestock farming in Waterloo, Wellington County. And in 15 years, it dropped to below 4. That's just in 15 years. And a lot of that is because now there's less livestock and a lot more corn, soy, corn, soy, corn, soy. That's hardened soil. So, I have a proposal. I think that we should measure the outcome of soil organic matter, not just the best management practice. There are a lot of people saying that we should do no-till or we should have cover crops, and those things are all good, but it depends on any one specific farm and as to what a farmer should most do. But what we really want is the outcome of soil organic matter. So we should measure that in every field in Ontario, every 5 years, with a consistent scientific protocol. Right now I'm working on a research program to use sensor technology so that we can do this a lot faster and more cost effectively. But even without that, I think it would be quite possible to do this. Now I want to go further. I think we should adjust farm property tax so that if your soil organic matter is good or very good or increasing, and you'll remember that previous slide, it showed you what good and very good means, then you pay less property tax if you're a farmer. If it's fair, poor, or going down, you pay more. Now, you folks are so polite, but when I say this at a farm meeting, they're with me right up till here. And as soon as I say that, I start looking for the exit doors. And they start lining up with the microphones, and they're ready to tell me what they think. They don't like the idea of paying more property tax. However, if you want to stop there, let's think about this. In Canada now, we give out $3.3 billion in fossil fuel subsidies for oil and gas producers and reduced property taxes. What if we stopped that and gave that $3.3 billion to farmers to sequester carbon? The International Energy Agency says that 13% of all energy-related CO2 comes from subsidized fossil fuels. We're subsidizing to the tune of $115 US per ton CO2 emitted. But if we gave it to farmers for service crops, we could sequester carbon, we could reduce nitrogen and phosphorus inputs, we could improve diversity, there are all kinds of things we could do. So there's very little risk that I'll become Prime Minister, even less than Premier of Ontario. But if I was, that's what I would want to make happen.
I'll vote.
Okay, thank you. I'll start my campaign now. 2 votes. Now, Stephanie All, this is a group of about 20 scientists from Scandinavia, and they've come out with a number of papers. There was one that was pivotal in 2009, another one in 2015, which I'll go back to, and then one this year. And it's called The Trajectories of Earth System in the Anthropocene. You know, the Holocene, most of the time, the 10,000 years that we've had agriculture, has been an ideal period climatically for agriculture. And now even people in the geosciences, people in geology are saying the Holocene is over. We've entered a new epoch. And they're calling it the Anthropocene. And there's about to be a formal vote as to whether or not we can really call this, but informally a lot of people are already there with the language of the Anthropocene. And it's curious how it took millions of years for some of these other epochs to pass, but in the last 200 to 300 years, we as people have had almost as big an impact with our industrial activities as what took many years in the past to accomplish. This goes back to the 2015 paper by Stephanie All, and they look at what they call planetary boundaries. And 2 of the big ones they argue that we're definitely crossing are the lack of genetic diversity, and along with that, functional diversity. And if you listen to the news today, we've lost 60% of animals from 1970 until today. So that just the news catching up with what scientists have been saying for a while. And the other big issue is phosphorus and nitrogen. We've only had nitrogen fixation, industrial nitrogen fixation, for over 100 years. Fritz Haber in Germany in 1908 figured out in his lab how to break apart nitrogen, tack on hydrogens, make ammonia, add one more ammonium, and plants like ammonia, yum, 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 and they eat that up and they grow. He did that in the lab. His buddy Bosch at about 1912 figured out how to scale it up, and we've had nitrogen fertilizer ever since. And it's been causing a huge problem in excess nitrate in water and nitrous oxide in the atmosphere. Phosphorus, we've been taking out of mines, and that's causing problems with algal blooms and so on too. Now, there we go. Now, this is Yuan Zhang. He's at the University of Guelph, and this is bitter melon. And we were growing it in high tunnels. No extra heat in the tunnels other than we gained about 2.5 weeks in the spring and another 2.5 weeks in the fall. And that made the difference in whether or not we could grow bitter melon. It's really good for diabetes. The Chinese folks in Toronto like it. If it comes from Ontario, it's local, and we grew it organically. We figured there was a good market for it. And the point is it's adding diversity. Yuban told me it was so good for me, he said, here, have one. It looks like a cucumber with pimples. So I just took a chomp. You're supposed to slice it up and cook it first. I didn't bother with that. And oh my, it was awful. But he laughed at me and he said, next time cook it. I will. We have 350,000 plant species, almost 200,000 with edible parts. Anybody guess how many we actually use? How much? 300? Yeah, you're right. Less than 300, but 17 provide 90% of humans' food. 17 species. And what are the big three? Corn?
Soy.
No, soy is Ontario, but not
Rice.
globally.
Wheat and
Rice. Corn, wheat, rice. That's right. Soy and potatoes are 4 and 5. They're right in there. So what we should be doing, I think, is growing diverse crop species, spreading the risk as climate change, rather than focusing so much on the few species that we know about and trying to get ever more out of those species. So this is an experiment that's been running at the Elora Research Station for about 35 years. And we realized that there was an increase of corn and soybean yields, an increase of yield stability, and an increase of soil organic matter, which is good, when corn and soy were integrated into diverse rotations with forages. So the complex rotation with forages is greater than this. So if you've got corn, soy, winter wheat, red clover, or corn, alfalfa, the yields, the yield stability, the soil organic matter are all better than if you just have corn, or corn, soy, corn, soy. Very boring and not good for yields. But in a bad year, in a drought year that I mentioned with Martin de Groot's farm, the difference is even more pronounced. So in a normal year, the corn yields and so on are better in this rotation. In a bad year, the difference is even more pronounced. Now, I also want to say something about soil organic matter and nitrogen and phosphorus from a reliable biological source. And you can imagine what I'm talking about here. We could source separate sewage. All new homes could replace water carriage with compost toilets. And we already can extract struvite as a pea source from sewage. The big concern, of course, are pathogens. And we have to learn how to compost these properly and deal with them. But we can't afford to have more than 7 billion people on Earth all emitting this sewage and not recapturing the nutrients. We've just got to figure out how to do it. And you'll have guessed by now that I'm a champion for organic farming. Organic farmers do not allow this. They don't want to touch it with a hole much longer than this. But I think at some point we've got to go there. I really think we've got to go there. And if necessary, we can apply it to non-food crops before we come back into that field, but we've got to decide how we're going to manage this. I mentioned N fertilizer and the fact that we've only had it for a little bit over 100 years. Phosphorus fertilizer, we've had a little bit longer. Today, about half the people depend directly on the Haber-Bosch process. Fritz Haber and his buddy Bosch developed this process. We've got excess N in nitrate and nitrous oxide in the air. And you remember those graphs with the planetary boundaries? The other thing that's really interesting is that nitrogen fertilizer is 1/3 of the global agricultural budget. And along with that, the biggest source of greenhouse gas emissions when you look at agriculture overall. It's not the tractors on the field, and it's not the trucks, as bad as they may be. It's the process for manufacturing nitrogen fertilizer that requires so much energy, and there are greenhouse gas emissions from that. Phosphorus is mined in Florida, China, and you can be sure we're not going to get any of that, and Morocco. That's pretty much it. There are a few little phosphorus mines up in northern Ontario, but nothing close to what we're going to need in the future. And some people say there are less than 100-year supply left of phosphorus in mines. Other people say 300. We know for sure that it won't last forever if we keep using phosphorus from mines. That's why I think we have to think about the sewage option. The other thing that's really interesting is that in 4 years, global food production went up twice. That's a lot. But nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium increased 5 to 7 times during the same period. So we doubled our food production, but we increased all of these 5 to 7 times. Now I want to go back to this idea of balancing production and consumption. Organic agriculture is now somewhere, yields are about 19 to 25% less. This study was done at UBC, and generally organic yields are about 19 to 25% less than conventional. What's so interesting is that in 1970, in the late 70s, when I started getting interested in organic, they were also about 20% less. In the 1990s, they were 20 to 25% less. Today, they're 20 to 25% less. They're both going up. Non-organic and organic are both going up. Organic's just behind because we don't have all the inputs. Now, suppose that mainstream was 19 to 25% less, and suppose that in society as a whole, we only wasted 15% food. Would we, in a society of 15% wasted food, would we aspire to produce 25% more so that we could waste 40%? I just want you to think about that.
What does the market want?
Good question. Now I'm going to do a little bit of a promo for organic here. This was a study that we did, this is 8 years ago now. We contrasted non-organic with organic, and the non-organic systems, well, the organic systems have a greater energy efficiency, less greenhouse gas, mostly because of not using nitrogen fertilizer. And this is per hectare and per unit of production, both ways. Profits are 22 to 35% higher in organic farms when the actual premiums are applied. Even with the lower yields, if we only need premiums of 5 to 7% to get the same profits that non-organic farms have. Now, I think we need to think about this. Monsanto was ordered to pay $290 million in the first Roundup cancer trial. That was this past summer. If glyphosate or Roundup is restricted or banned, how might organic weed control help all of agriculture? What would it look like if we had a world without Roundup? suddenly all the research we've been doing in organic would become really interesting. And these are organic no-till systems. For a long time, I was criticized, and all my colleagues that were involved in organic research were criticized because we used too much tillage. And my colleagues would say, oh, you're all diesel fuel farmers. You waste too much diesel fuel going through doing tillage, and you're rooting the soil. No-till is the way to go. The problem at the time was that if you wanted to do no-till, you had to use herbicides in order to control the weeds. And often people used Roundup-ready crops and then used Roundup to control the weeds. Then, and I'm proud to say this was in a Mennonite machine shop that the roller crimper was developed. I grew up in Elmira, Wallenstein. I'm a Mennonite, Martin. So this was developed in a Mennonite machine shop. It's like a rolling pin, and then you have these flanges, and they're slightly on an angle, and it can go through a field, and it can knock down a cover crop of rye, and then you can have a no-till planter behind it, and you can no-till seed corn or soy or just about anything into that cover crop. Now we're at the point where people like Howard Buffett, the son of Warren Buffett, who farms thousands of acres. He doesn't want to become organic, but he loves the roller crimper because it means that he can save a lot of money on herbicides and pesticides. He still uses them if he needs to a little bit, but he's using the roller crimper, and he says it's the best piece of equipment he's ever bought. And there are a lot of conventional farmers now, non-organic, who are now using this weed control system. And there are many others. And then there was a student of mine, Heather Beach, and she wrote a paper just in February this year. It was published about how dependence on tillage is a strike against organic. We have agronomic success depends strongly on the cover crop ability. If we just have 6 tons per hectare of cover crop, that's not enough. You've got to have at least 9. And years are different, and how do you make sure you get 9? Vegetables are more susceptible. Sometimes you do the roller crimper at the front. Here's a no-till planter at the back. And if it doesn't work out, and there's still a few weeds, you might have to mow them or do high residue tillage or add mulch. But there are options. And I just think it's so interesting with that organic and non-organic farmers have come together on this little Mennonite machine shop invention. Allow me to say a little bit about the organic science clusters. The first one was 2009. I spent hours and hours and hours writing that proposal. We did finally get $9 million for organic research across Canada. Organic Science Cluster 2 was from 2013 to 2018, and now we're just starting our Organic Science Cluster 3. Here's the link, all about the organic research that's been going on across Canada. In Ontario, the organic sector has 2% of food sales and 0.4% of OMAPRA research funds. Why shouldn't organic get at least 5 times more, just to make sure that we're up to where we are at the 2%? And why is it that farm checkoff fees, organic farmers send all their checkoff fees to non-organic organizations? What's wrong with that?
What is checkoff fee?
Well, that means if you sell a bushel of soybean, you might pay a few pennies. Right now, that goes to the Grain Farmers of Ontario. It doesn't go to OCO, the Organic Council of Ontario. I want to say just a little bit about dependable agricultural land. Classes 1, 2, and 3 are dependable, and half of the Class 1 land in Canada can be seen from the top of the CN Tower in a clear day, except most of it's under pavement. We need to protect Class 1, 2, and 3 land. 4, 5, and 6 are less dependable. They don't have as dependable yields. We really need our good, dependable ag land. I'm not sure what minister I'd be to have to do this, but if I was a minister, I would say that instead of a green belt policy, we need a green dot policy. Wherever we have a class 1, 2, or 3 land, we just don't develop it. It doesn't matter where it is. You can only develop class 4, 5, and 6. Of course, that's harder to develop. There's rocks and slopes and all that. Developers have lots of money. They can figure it out. But we should not be developing class 1, 2, and 3. As you can see, I'm not exactly balanced about that, I guess, in the way I present it. I'm fairly dogmatic. This is my last slide. I think it's really important to have an attitude of gratitude. I think we should be thankful that we have good land and food in Canada. And it's really important to appreciate when we have enough, and then to think about how we can share. This is my webpage. I invite you to go there, and I do Twitter sometimes and send out tweets, and you're welcome to go there too. And I'd love to hear what kinds of comments or questions you have. Yes?
Reproduction of organic agriculture. I was in Anne Clark's first year organic agriculture course. And I've been involved with organic agriculture for 23 years, but in that course, it was never said that organic agriculture did not produce as much. It actually, Elaine Ingham, she's like a doctorate student from Soil Food Web, she grew GMO crops and they did not produce enough. So that's all new, Ralph, for me to hear you saying that, and that's why I had to stand up.
Okay. Well, it's true that in some cases some organic farmers can grow more, and in head-to-head tests sometimes. But on average in society, like when they did that study at UBC, when they look at all the organic farms and all the non-organic farms and take the average, on average the yields are 19 to 25% lower in organic farms.
That's new information for what I've learned. It's a new look, maybe with a new tool of looking.
Well, it's if you just do a head-to-head test, you can sometimes get equal yields, or organic can be a little bit higher. But generally, if you look at data from all the farms that are now operating, organic is usually 20% less.
Okay,
and it's always been that way.
No.
Anyway, that's what I'll put out. And
Yeah,
if you want to show me a study that's different, I'll definitely have a look at it. Yes?
I'm not a farmer at heart, but I've lived in
shame
farming.
on you.
I know. I've lived in farming communities over the years. Where did the idea, like a lot of times when they did their fall work, they always were out tilling, you know, like disking the land, getting it ready, sort of they call it getting ready for winter or waiting for spring. So where did that practice sort of come from? Like, because many would say that's important to do for the land, and whereas they also, some of them would buy into the alfalfa and rotating of crops. But where did that, do you have a sense of where that practice sort of came from, and why did it get so widely accepted that this was what should be done?
Well, I think before chemicals, tillage and fall plowing was a way to manage your weeds. Like you could plow them under, that dealt with them. It was also a way to deal with pests, and you could get rid of a whole lot of pests if you plowed it in, and everything was clean and tidy. That became really popular before chemical farming, and then it was the chemicals that made no-till possible. And then they realized that there were a whole lot of soil benefits to no-till, and that's when the organic people had to get on board and figure out how to do it without chemicals. That's a very brief history, but
no, I just appreciate it, because you would talk to some people and they would just see that as that's what I do in the fall.
That was very common practice in the 40s, 50s, 60s. Yeah, it's very common. Yeah.
I was just going to ask how you, I like your idea of trying to encourage people to improve soil organic matter, but with the growing amount of farmland in Ontario that's rented, how does that How do you make an incentive for?
Well,
for
this
passive
would be for owners.
Right.
So the owner would have to pay more tax if their soil organic matter was going down. So that would mean that they would then have to make a deal with the operator to make sure the operator was using cover crops and appropriate practices to bring the soil organic matter up. Right now, a lot of owners are just happy to get the highest rental rate they can get. But if they had to pay more tax because the soil organic matter was being driven down, they'd be quite happy to take a little less in a rental rate and to write in clauses about what the operator had to do to make sure that the soil organic matter was going in the right direction. And it's just because there is something like, I don't remember the stat right now, but I think over half of the land in Ontario now is rented. And it seems to me that this would be a way to put pressure on the owners to make sure that they're asking the operators to do what they should be doing. You had a comment.
Yeah, it was just an opinion question. I appreciated you sharing the innovation that took place in the Mennonite workshop. And I'm always curious around where innovations come from, and I'm wondering if you can share your thoughts on where you think some of the next great innovations will come from for ag.
Well, you know, there's some fascinating work being done now with robotics and weed control. And there's a little unit called a robot, an ROW bot. And it goes up and down corn rows. And right now, it can seed cover crops. Some farmers use it to add fertilizer. But they're also training them to pull weeds. They recognize every plant that's not corn, and they push it into the ground. So ROW robots, they work 24/7, no coffee breaks. Sometimes come back for a charge, but some of them have solar panels up above the corn, so they can just keep going. And there are now garden plots with raised beds, and they have this little unit on rails, and it can sense weeds, and as soon as it sees a weed, there's a little plunger, pushes it in. So I think robotics, in Germany they've developed a cone weeder. It can go through a field of oats and barley, and the oats and barley go through, and the unit will cut all the weeds. There are all kinds of very fascinating weeders. There's a new weeder now with vegetables. If you do your transplants, and they're exactly the same distance in the row, this weeder will go along and go, it goes in between the rows, and they're all guidance systems, so they have sensors to see, so the weeder doesn't hit the crop, but it gets everything else. So I think there's a lot of opportunity in robotics with weed control. I think in livestock farming, we haven't quite yet figured out the potential of forages. I think, like, I'm so biased about forages. I'm almost as biased about forages as I am about soil organic matter. But soil organic, forages are so good for the soil, and always have been. And I think there are ways that we can improve and breed forages to get better performance from ruminants. I think we also have a lot to learn about, instead of using forages to feed ruminants, sheep and cattle, we might use forages to feed earthworms and soil microbes and learn more about how to do that. And that might give us some real benefits too. Those are just a few things off the top of my head. Yeah.
Now, in that, you haven't mentioned hydroponics, but you go to a place like the Netherlands, the acre and acre and acre of glass, and there's no soil at all. Are there ups and downs for that?
Yeah, I still find it hard to give up on soil. I really like the soil. You know, people argue that with hydroponics or aquaponics we can do what we need to do, and we can mix in compost and liquefy it and all that, but there's so much going on in soil with soil microbes and soil life and so on. I'm not sure that in the long run we're really going to be able to mimic that appropriately in an aquaponic system. I might be wrong. And I have a student who was in my class last year, and he's from the Philippines. And he's told me about some really amazing systems they have there, where they have, they're growing duckweed and they're getting all kinds of production there with fish and so on. So my mind's not closed on that. I'm having a hard time letting go of soil. And in the organic standards, for example, in Ontario, you're not allowed to use hydroponics. You still have to use soil.
Really?
At this point, yeah. Yes?
What do you think is the reason that organics doesn't get subsidized to the extent that conventional farming does?
There have been many reasons over the years. For a long time, I think it was felt in government circles that it wasn't the way to get a lot of production. And after the Second World War, we were spooked into thinking we had to grow more and more and more. And everything that we did was geared toward growing more food. Now I think consumers are pushing back and they're saying, wait a minute, it's not quantity we're so interested in, we're more interested in quality. Certainly the market is there. GTA, the market for organic in GTA is far larger than what Ontario farmers are providing. There's a huge market opportunity for Ontario farmers just to produce what is in the GTA. It's difficult for farmers to do that because there's a 3-year transition period, and right now there's no government help for that. So your yields are as low as they're ever going to be if you go from conventional to organic in those 3 years. You don't get a premium for those 3 years. You're learning a new system. So you have to have a really good cash flow, and you have to be financially stable before you take the risk of going through the transition. Having said that, the market in the GTA has been really solid for 20 years, and it grows every year. Yes?
You talked about dependable agricultural land.
Yes.
That resonates with losing farmers from the farmers market. Like my farmer who grows all my organic meat and does it at a low price, she's moving. So then that farmer who provides all this community with the food is at risk of losing that local farm source. So I would love, and I've just started a little kernel of thinking, how can we make sure that that farm and that production stays so this community has food security? And that's one point that resonates. And then there's another point, that in this election year federally, if people realize that the US farmers get subsidies and the European farmers get subsidies, like let's demand that our farmers get subsidies. Like it's an election year, it's your point of leverage.
Okay. Going back to the farmer, I think it's really important to develop relationships with farmers. And quite often I hear people say, well, if there's a big crisis, I bought 50 acres somewhere and I'm going to go out and live in my 50 acres and I'll be fine. But these are people who are telling me this who lived in the city all their lives and wouldn't know a hoe from a rake. And I think that a better resiliency plan is just to have a good relationship with a farmer and somebody who does know what they're doing, and make sure those farmers are viable and keep supporting them. I think that's really a good point. Yeah.
There's a great organization called the Ontario Farmland Trust that works to permanently protect farmland and keep it from being developed into anything other than farmland. They're based out of Guelph here, and that's exactly what they do. Is they work with producers who are retiring or moving and don't want to see that farm get converted to something else, and try and figure out long-term plans to keep it in production. Also, I want to thank you, Martin, Ralph, for your references to the Organic Council of Ontario and the work that I'm on the board of directors of the Organic Council of Ontario. I work in organic certification. I took Ralph's courses at Guelph, and I took Anne's course at Guelph, and I am currently sitting on the board that is currently rewriting the Canadian Organic Standard for 2020. So if you have questions about where this stuff is going in the future, or stats or that kind of stuff, feel free to come talk to me. I'm here every Sunday. Well, almost every Sunday. but yeah, like just some really fantastic points. I'd love to hear from you if there's anything that you would like to see in the next Canadian standard that could really change the way organics. I'd love to talk about biosolids, but I know that's not going to get touched in this revision. There was one other thing I wanted to do. Have you had any experience with really complex crop rotations where producers are actually growing 3 or 4 different crops in the same field at the same time, combining them all together, and then separating them all out? We're seeing it out west.
Not 3 or 4 yet. No, I don't have experience with farmers doing that, but I did my PhD thesis on intercropping.
Yeah.
I was limited to 2 at that point, but yeah, I think there's a lot of potential for that. There's a lot of potential for more complexity in the way we grow plants, and that's the way people have been growing plants for years and years. I was in Uganda a few years ago, and I was standing in on a farmer's plot. It was about an acre, and without moving, I could count 14 different species just from standing there, like at all levels. Like, it was an amazing permaculture system. And what was so fascinating was it was the woman who was really interested in maintaining that diversity. The husband, we were on a sweet potato tour, so the husband was interested in using more and more of that land to grow sweet potatoes because there was a cash opportunity for sweet potatoes. So he was interested in getting cash for the household, which they needed to send their children to school, and she wanted to maintain the diversity. And you could hear the tension just as we were asking questions about what was going on there. But there are farms all over Africa and Latin America that have used complex systems for years. And maybe to answer your question, going back to more complexity with plants, I think and with permaculture systems. I've got a farmer I'm working with now who wants to have, he's using guidance systems, so he's got just tiny little rows where he's going to grow corn 1 year, soybean the next, wheat, sunflowers, a different row crop every year, but between those rows, he's going to have a permanent stand of forages. And he hasn't quite figured out how to do it, but he's buying the equipment and he's working on it. Part of it will involve mowing that rather than tilling it. You just mow it, and then when the main crop gets up, it will sit there. And we did that research about 20 years ago, but he's taking it to a new level, and so far he's doing it in the backfield so his neighbors can't see it, but he's done some really interesting work so far, and I think it's going to be fast.